Lord, I don't ask for riches or fame. I just want my son to live. If there's any mercy left in this world, please let it find us now. Amen. Marquita Joseph had never felt so alone, yet surrounded by so many. The hospital hallway buzzed with activity, nurses wheeling carts, doctors whispering in corners, families clinging to hope, but her world had narrowed down to the sound of one fragile heartbeat on a monitor. Her 6-year-old son, Armani, lay pale and barely breathing behind the thick glass of the pediatric ICU. Machines beeped, tubes ran across his chest. She stood there with her hand pressed against the window, whispering the words of a prayer she'd spoken every night since his diagnosis. She had fought every battle as a mother with quiet strength, teaching him to tie his shoes, holding his hand during shots, soothing his nightmares when he missed a father he never knew. But this fight? This was beyond her. Armani needed a bone marrow transplant, immediately, and after all the local registries and distant donor networks turned up empty, there was only one match left in the world. Only one. The man she had once loved with all her heart. The man who walked out 5 years ago, never knowing he left behind more than just a broken promise. The man who now held her son's life in his hands. Ken Keith, billionaire, tech genius, charitable face of every glossy fundraiser on the West Coast, and the father of her child. Marquita hadn't planned to call him. She had buried that chapter, mourned it in silence, and focused on building a life with dignity and faith. But now? Armani's life wasn't a memory she could hide behind her smile. It was a desperate plea for mercy that only Ken could answer. She stood outside the hospital chapel, clutching a cheap flip phone she hadn't touched in years, the one that still had his number buried in an old contact list. Her fingers hovered above the call button, trembling. Tears blurred her vision as she whispered, "Lord, help me." She pressed the button. It rang once. His voice, smooth, familiar, older. "Hi, you've reached Ken Keith." Just hearing it made her legs weaken. She hung up. And then the phone rang. Incoming call, K. Keith. Her breath caught. Her knees nearly buckled. She stared at the screen like it was a ghost from another life. With all the strength she had left, Marquita pressed answer. "Hello? Marquita?" It was him. The man who'd once held her hand and promised forever. The man she had not seen in 5 years. The man whose blood might save their son. She couldn't speak. The words tangled in her throat. He repeated softly, "Marquita, is everything okay?" She closed her eyes. "No," she said, her voice cracking. "Everything is not okay. Ken, Armani is sick. He's dying. And you're the only match we have." Silence. Then, his voice, trembling. "Armani?" "Yes," she whispered. "Your son." Secrets have a way of sitting heavy on the chest. Quiet, invisible, but always there. Marquita had carried hers alone for nearly 6 years, not because she wanted to, not because she enjoyed holding the truth close, but because life had pushed her into a corner where silence felt safer than reopening wounds she barely survived. She remembered the early days with Ken, when love felt easy, when he held her hand during church services, when he'd pick her up after choir rehearsal with take-out bags and that boyish smile that made her heart flutter. Back then, she believed their future was already written, bright and certain. But life often writes stories with messy handwriting. When he left, abruptly, painfully without looking back, she convinced herself he didn't need to know about the baby growing inside her. She didn't want to chase him or beg him to stay. Her pride wouldn't let her. Her heart wouldn't allow it. He had made his choice, and she refused to become a burden to a man who said he loved her yet couldn't stay. So she protected her peace the only way she knew how, by keeping her pregnancy private. Some people judged her for it. Most never knew the full truth. But mothers don't operate on perfection. They operate on instinct, and her instinct told her that raising Armani in love, stability and faith, even without Ken, would be better than bringing him into a world where one parent was physically present but emotionally miles away. Still, secrets don't stay buried when a child's life is on the line. As she stood in that hospital waiting room hours earlier, staring at the doctor who had just told her there were no more options, no more donors, no more chances, she realized something. Her silence could cost her son his life. The weight of that truth nearly suffocated her. How many mothers out there knew this feeling? The moment when pride no longer mattered, when heartbreak no longer mattered, when history no longer mattered. Only survival mattered, only love mattered, only their child's next breath mattered. Marquita knew she wasn't the only woman who'd made a difficult choice to protect her heart. She wasn't the only woman who had tried to move forward after being left behind. And she wasn't the only one who prayed every night that her past would stay in the past. But sometimes, the past becomes the only lifeline to the future. Ever kept a secret, she whispered to herself earlier that day, only to watch it rise when you least expect it? Her hands shook as she held the doctor's report, a match found at last, but attached to the name she thought she'd never speak again. The name of the man who once lifted her higher than she'd ever felt, and dropped her lower than she ever imagined possible. Every part of her wanted to protect herself from that pain. But Armani needed more than her protection. He needed a chance to live. So she swallowed the truth she had carried so long. She dialed the number she swore she'd never call, and she prayed that God would turn her fear into strength. Now, as Ken's voice filled her ear for the first time in years, Marquita felt her whole world tremble, not from regret, but from the unbearable fear that she had waited too long. Would he understand? Would he be angry? Would he even care? Her heart pounded as she gripped the phone tighter, because the truth was no longer a secret, it was a plea. And behind that plea was a child fighting for his life. No mother should ever have to hear the words, "We've exhausted the registry. He needs a perfect match to survive. There's only one donor left, and it's someone from your past." But Marquita Joseph didn't live in a perfect world. She lived in a borrowed chair beside her son's hospital bed, watching as his small chest rose and fell with the help of machines, trying not to cry every time the monitors blinked out another warning. 6-year-old Armani, once the loudest singer in the children's choir, could barely whisper now. His energy was gone. His color had faded. The nurses smiled politely, but their eyes carried stories Marquita wasn't ready to hear. The diagnosis, aplastic anemia, a rare blood disorder. His bone marrow was shutting down, quietly, cruelly. The only path to survival was a donor transplant. They had tried everything. The church put out flyers. Aunt Ebony called every cousin in 3 states. The hospital contacted every national registry, but none of them matched. Not even the man she once believed might be Armani's father, until a name came up. One name, Ken Keith. Marquita froze when the doctor said it. It had been years since she last saw his name printed on anything. Not on headlines, not on donation plaques, not on her phone. Now, he appeared on a hospital printout as the only genetic match in the entire country for the boy she had raised alone. The irony of it didn't escape her. He left her behind when his career exploded. He left before he even knew Armani existed. He left with nothing but a rushed apology and a plane ticket. Now he was the only one who could save the life of the child he never knew. The doctor had said it plainly. If Ken Keith agrees to the donation, we can begin preparation immediately. But if he doesn't, there may not be another option. Marquita had always been strong. She raised her son with grit, gospel, and grace. But when she held that sheet of paper with Ken's name and donor match code printed in bold at the top, her fingers trembled. What if he said no? What if he ignored her call? What if the man who once turned his back now turned his heart? The stakes weren't emotional anymore. They were medical. Life and death. For a child who had never known what it felt like to throw a baseball with his father. For a boy who had only heard about Ken from whispered stories and old photographs tucked in drawers. Marquita knew reaching out would open wounds. It would mean facing everything she buried. Grief, resentment, loneliness. Armani mattered. His life, his chance. And if it meant reliving every heartbreak just to buy him one more day, one more week, one more year, Marquita would do it. She'd already made the call. Ken had picked up. Now they were both standing on the edge of a moment that could change everything. Would he come? Would he show up for a child he never knew? Would he face the woman he left behind? And even if he did, was it already too late? Time slowed the moment Ken's voice came through the phone. Marquita could hardly breathe. "Armani," he repeated softly. "He's my son?" "Yes." Her voice cracked. "Your son, and he's dying, Ken." A long pause followed, heavy, loaded, fragile. Marquita stood outside the hospital doors, her fingers clutching the collar of her hoodie against the evening wind, her soul on edge. Every second stretched like an eternity. Then finally, he spoke. "I'm on a plane," Ken said. "I'll be there before sunrise." She sank to her knees. For a moment, hope breathed again. But even as the call ended, even as she returned to Armani's room with tears in her eyes and a whisper of thanks on her lips, a deeper fear lingered. What if he was too late? Would the doctors say they waited too long? Would Armani hold on? And even if Ken came in time to be the donor, could a single act undo years of distance, pain, and silence? Would Marquita's heart, still bruised from the day he walked away, ever trust him again? Could love survive the very thing that once broke it? Ken was coming back to face his past, back to the woman who once gave him her whole heart, and was left to pick up the pieces alone, back to a son who didn't know his face, his voice, his touch, but whose survival now depended on his very blood. It was no longer about apologies, or money, or status. This was about a father finding his child, a mother risking everything for the one person who made her life matter, and a little boy caught in the space between goodbye and redemption. As the lights dimmed in the ICU and monitors hummed quietly through the night, Marquita looked out the window toward the landing strip of the small city airport. All she could do was wait for the man who left, to come back not as a CEO, not as a success story, but as a father, as a man willing to save the life of the only person who could bring them both back together. The question now wasn't whether Ken was capable of saving Armani. It was this: would he stay once the surgery was done? Would he be more than a match, and finally be a father? The walls of the pediatric ICU were too white, too quiet, and too cold for comfort. Marquita Joseph walked back and forth in a worn line in front of room 14B, her sneakers silent against the vinyl floor. She didn't care who stared anymore. The pain etched into her eyes told any onlooker exactly why she was there. Through the glass window, her son Armani lay motionless on the bed, tangled in a web of 4 lines, oxygen tubes, and monitoring wires. His little chest rose and fell slowly, each breath assisted by machines she didn't understand but had come to fear. A nurse walked by with a clipboard, nodding gently at Marquita. She tried to smile in return, but her lips barely moved. Her braids were pulled into a frayed bun, and her eyes were swollen from nights without rest. Her hoodie had dried stains from a spilled apple juice box Armani had dropped on the way to urgent care, back when this was just a fever they thought would pass. Now it was something else. She clutched a crumpled drawing in her palm, one Armani had given her last week. It was a stick-figure version of their family, him and her standing beside a big yellow sun. Underneath, in shaky letters, it read, "Mummy, I love you big like the sky." Her chest tightened. Inside the room, Armani's fingers twitched, a faint movement, the smallest sign of life. She pressed her forehead to the glass. "Hold on, baby," she whispered. "I'm right here." The click of shoes brought her out of her daze. Dr. Fletcher, a tall black woman in her early 42nds with round glasses and the calmest voice Marquita had ever heard, approached with a chart clutched to her chest. Her face was kind but guarded, one that had delivered hard news more than once. "Marquita," she said softly, motioning toward the family consultation room. "Can we talk for a minute?" Marquita didn't want to leave Armani's side. Not for a second, but she nodded and followed. Inside the small room, there was no avoiding the sterile tension. A print of ocean waves hung on the wall like it was supposed to bring peace. It didn't. Dr. Fletcher pulled out a folder, flipping it open with quiet precision. "We got the final lab results back," she began, folding her hands. "It confirms our suspicions. Armani has aplastic anemia." Marquita blinked, mouth dry. "What does that mean exactly?" "It's a rare condition," Dr. Fletcher explained gently. "His bone marrow has stopped producing enough blood cells, red, white, and platelets. That's why he's been so weak. That's why the fevers and bruises haven't gone away." Marquita swallowed hard. "Is it treatable?" Dr. Fletcher nodded. "There are treatments, yes, but in Armani's case, because of how quickly his counts have dropped, he's going to need a bone marrow transplant. That's our best shot." The world shifted beneath Marquita's feet. "A transplant? You mean from a donor?" she asked quietly. "Yes," Dr. Fletcher confirmed. "A compatible donor. A full match, ideally." Marquita leaned back in the plastic chair, the drawing still balled up in her hand. "How do we find one?" Dr. Fletcher hesitated. "That's what we're working on next." The search began immediately. Within hours, the nurses had drawn blood from Marquita and several family members, her sister, cousins, even her Aunt Ebony, who rushed in from her job at the local library, lined up to be tested. Marquita sat in Armani's room that evening, clutching his hand as lab techs moved quickly through the corridor, samples packed in cold storage boxes headed for testing centers. She prayed over each vial. "Please let one of us be a match." But the days dragged on. One by one the results trickled in. No match, no match. Close but not close enough. Dr. Fletcher explained that partial matches weren't good enough. Armani's counts were too low. He needed a perfect genetic alignment to have a fighting chance. They turned to the National Bone Marrow Registry. Nothing. They tried regional lists. Still nothing. Marquita began losing hope as the days stretched into a week. She sat with Dr. Fletcher again in the consultation room. This time, the doctor didn't even open the folder. Her eyes spoke before her mouth did. "I'm sorry," she said, voice steady but heavy. "None of the registries came back positive. We're running out of options." Marquita felt her lungs freeze. "You mean that's it?" Dr. Fletcher leaned forward. "There's one other thing we can try. You said before that Armani's father was not in the picture?" Marquita's stomach dropped. "Yeah," she whispered. "He's not." Dr. Fletcher chose her words carefully. "If there's any chance he could be the biological father, we need to test him. He might be the match we've been looking for." Marquita left the meeting and found herself back in the hospital chapel. She sat on the back pew, alone, the flickering LED candles offering the only light. She didn't cry often anymore. She hadn't since Armani was a baby. But now, the weight of everything pressed down at once. Grief, fear, exhaustion, guilt. Her face crumpled. She wept, silently at first, then with her whole body. Sobs ripped from her throat as she bent forward, clutching her knees. "I've done everything I know how to do," she whispered to no one. Why isn't it enough? She wasn't angry at God. She wasn't even angry at Ken. She was just broken. A mother watching her child slip away while the world kept spinning. "Baby?" Aunt Ebony. She walked in slowly and wrapped her arms around Marquita's shoulders. No words, just warmth, just presence. Marquita buried her face in her aunt's chest and cried harder. "I don't want to lose him," she choked out. "I can't lose him." "You won't," Aunt Ebony said firmly, "but you've got to be brave now. Brave enough to do what hurts." That night, back in the hospital room, Marquita sat beside Armani's bed in the dim blue glow of the heart monitor. She smoothed a blanket over his legs and traced his curls with her fingers. Her mind drifted back to Ken. She hadn't spoken his name out loud in years. They met at a community church. She had just finished singing in the choir when he walked in, wearing a crisp shirt and expensive shoes, looking like he didn't belong, but smiling like he wished he did. He told her that day, "You sing like peace sounds." They'd been inseparable for a year. He fit into her world, Sunday dinners, block parties, church revivals, and she even began learning his world, galas, business calls, tech conferences. But then came the distance, the empty seat at family dinners, the late-night texts instead of calls, the quiet guilt in his eyes when he came home smelling like hotels and airports, until finally, the night he sat her down and said, "I can't be the man you need and the man I'm trying to become." He left. She let him. And 2 months later, she found out she was pregnant. Now 5 years later, his name was printed at the top of a donor match sheet. Dr. Fletcher had somehow pulled old insurance records tied to Armani's early pediatric files. A flag had been raised when an out-of-date emergency contact was linked to Ken's clinic. They ran his DNA against Armani's. A 100% match. Marquita had stared at that paper for hours. Ken was Armani's biological father, and the only person on earth who could save him. But to reach out, to reopen that wound, to let him in, even just for this, it felt like swallowing glass. What if he rejected them? What if he didn't believe her? What if he agreed to donate, but left again? Could Armani survive that kind of heartbreak? Could she? Marquita stood outside the hospital, phone in hand, breathing hard. She'd told herself she could do this alone, but alone hadn't worked. Not this time. She opened the old phone. It was a cheap backup she kept in the kitchen drawer. And it still had his number, unchanged. She stared at the contact name, Ken K. Her finger hovered. The wind picked up. Her breath clouded in the evening chill. "I'm doing this for you," she whispered. Glancing back toward the ICU window where Armani slept, she pressed call. It rang. Once, twice, 3 times. Voicemail. Her heart dropped until the screen flashed. Incoming call, K. Keith. Her hand shook. She answered. "Hello? Marquita?" His voice. Same as before, only deeper. Older, tired, her eyes welled. "Ken, Armani's sick. He's your son, and he needs you. A pause. Then, "I'm coming." The sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows of New Hope Baptist Church, painting colourful shadows on the wooden pews. It was a typical Sunday morning on the south side, mothers in wide-brimmed hats, little boys tugging at stiff collars, and deacons lined up at the front, nodding in rhythm to the choir's melody. And then, her voice rose. Marquita Joseph stood at the front of the choir stand, eyes closed, swaying slightly as she sang the lead to His Eye Is on the Sparrow. Her voice, smooth as honey and strong as thunder, filled the sanctuary like it was born there. People leaned forward, a few closed their eyes. Some cried quietly. In the last pew, a man sat frozen. Ken Keith didn't quite blend in. He wore designer shoes and a navy blazer with an unbuttoned collar. No tie. He looked like a man who had typed local church near me into his GPS that morning, out of curiosity more than conviction. But when Marquita sang, something shifted. She wasn't just leading a song, she was testifying. After the service, while kids ran around with snack bags and the older women started organizing next week's potluck, Ken stood awkwardly near the refreshment table with a paper cup of punch. Marquita walked by, laughing with two choir members. She glanced at him but didn't slow down. He cleared his throat. "Excuse me, that was beautiful." She turned, arching a brow. "The song," he added quickly. "Your voice. I've never heard anything like it." Marquita smiled politely, then dipped her head in a shy nod. "Thank you." "I'm Ken," he said, offering a hand. I sponsored the new rec center next door. The pastor invited me today." Her eyes flickered. "Oh, right. The tech guy." He laughed. "Guilty. I build apps and software, but I swear I'm not completely soulless." She chuckled, finally shaking his hand. "Marquita," she said. That was how it started. In the weeks that followed, their paths kept crossing. Ken started coming to church more often, always quiet, always observant. He sat in the third pew, took notes during sermons, and stayed for the fellowship meals, even if he clearly didn't know how to two-step at the church socials. Marquita, raised in the same neighborhood her whole life, had never been around someone like him. He lived in a high-rise in Midtown, with floor-to-ceiling windows and a voice-activated coffee machine. She lived in a two-bedroom apartment with her Aunt Ebony, a rescue dog named Troy, and a hallway lined with family photos and graduation caps. His world moved fast. Investors, beta tests, travel to tech expos in Austin and LA. Her world moved steady. Sunday worship, choir rehearsals, neighborhood cleanups. He talked about IPOs and user retention rates. She talked about God's grace and raising kids in a village. It didn't clash. It intrigued them both. She liked how curious he was about her faith, how he never mocked what he didn't understand. He liked how rooted she was in her values, how nothing swayed her spirit. Still, there were awkward moments, like when he invited her to a startup mixer downtown and she showed up in a thrifted sundress while every other woman wore designer jumpsuits. Or when she brought him to the church's annual cookout and he asked, "What's a neck bone?" But they laughed, a lot. And in between the culture shock was something deeper, something real. Ken started texting her daily, not just "How was your day?" but real messages. "Do you ever sing just for yourself? What was your dream before people told you to be realistic? What do you think faith means when life is falling apart?" She answered every one. They went from church friends to late-night phone calls to early morning coffee runs before her preschool shift and his investor briefings. He once surprised her with tickets to a gospel jazz fusion show downtown. She surprised him with a homemade banana pudding he swore changed his life. On their first official date, they walked through Piedmont Park at sunset. Marquita wore a flowy skirt and sandals. Ken wore sneakers and carried a mini cooler filled with her favorite tea. They didn't kiss that night. They just talked. About how his mom had passed away when he was 19. About how Marquita never knew her dad. About music, legacy, and what it meant to feel seen. By their third date, they had started holding hands in public. By the sixth, he whispered, "I think I'm falling in love with you." Marquita didn't say it back, not yet, but she smiled and didn't let go of his hand. If Ken had any doubts about being accepted in Marquita's world, they faded the day she brought him to a cousin's graduation barbecue. Her Uncle Clyde grilled ribs and told Ken to bring him a cold soda or you ain't getting a plate. Her niece Jay braided a small section of Ken's hair and declared, "Now you in the family." Aunt Ebony handed him a slice of red velvet cake and whispered, "We'll keep you, if you keep her smiling like that." Even the pastor took him aside and said, "You look out for her, son. She's precious to us." Church folks had a way of being suspicious of outsiders, especially rich ones. But Ken didn't show up with ego. He showed up with his heart. He helped set up folding chairs for Sunday services when the AC broke. He gave the church drummer a ride when his car gave out. He attended the weekly men's prayer breakfast even though he barely knew the verses. To them, he wasn't Ken Keith, the tech CEO. He was Marquita's Ken, and to her, that meant everything. One evening, Ken showed up unannounced to choir rehearsal. He sat in the back pew, unnoticed, until the first note rang out. Marquita stood at the front, directing the altos, her body moving gently in rhythm with the harmonies. Her voice carried effortlessly above the others, full, commanding, wrapped in spirit. He didn't move the whole time. After rehearsal, she found him in the parking lot leaning against his car, eyes still wide. "You okay?" she asked, laughing. He looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time. "I've sat in meetings with billionaires," he said, "been in rooms with people who think they run the world. But when you sing, Marquita, everything else feels small." She blushed and looked away. He stepped closer. "I mean it. Your voice, it changes the room." "No," she whispered. "It just reminds people they're not alone." He kissed her forehead that night. She finally said it back. "I love you." Ken started spending more time in her world than his. She went with him to a corporate dinner once, just to see his world, and left early because it felt too shallow. They balanced each other. She reminded him to breathe. He reminded her she was allowed to dream big. Ken began looking for ways to invest in her community, starting with the preschool she worked at. He offered tech upgrades, reading tablets, and even a new play yard, but he did it quietly, no news articles, no headlines. Marquita respected that. She didn't want a savior. She wanted a partner, and for a while, that's exactly what he was. They talked about the future, kids, music studios, maybe even marriage, but deep down, they both knew something would eventually test what they had. They just didn't know it would come so soon. One evening, after Bible study, as they walked under the amber glow of the streetlights, Ken stopped suddenly. "Come with me," he said. "Where?" "San Francisco. I've got a pitch meeting next week, but I want you there. I want you to see that part of my life." She hesitated. "I don't belong in those spaces," she said softly. Ken reached for her hand. "You belong everywhere, and I want the people in my world to meet the woman who keeps me grounded." Marquita smiled, hesitant but flattered. "I'll think about it." "No," he said with a grin. "Say yes." She looked into his eyes. Yes. They kissed under the street lamp, a soft kiss that tasted like possibility. Neither of them knew it would be the last time their lives felt that simple. Ken's trip to San Francisco turned into a turning point, not just for his startup, but for everything. What was meant to be a 4-day pitch meeting turned into a series of high-stakes investor conferences, unexpected board dinners, and sleepless nights building back-end software patches. His inbox exploded. His face began appearing on tech blogs as the disruptor from the South, and before Marquita could wrap her mind around the change, he was flying to Boston for a panel, then New York for a demo, then Tokyo for a product launch. At first he called daily, even sent little video clips of hotel breakfasts or views from sky lounges, telling her how much he missed her. She'd laugh and send back videos of the preschool kids doing cartwheels during music time. But soon the calls turned into texts, then voice notes, then silence, followed by apologies that arrived too late. Marquita sat in her living room late one night staring at her phone. The screen read, "Sorry, babe. Can't talk. We'll call tomorrow. Promise." That promise would be broken by a glowing headline, "Ken Keith named top 5 innovator in Silicon Valley's rising tech elite." She was proud. She really was. But she also knew something had shifted. The Ken who used to rush to choir rehearsal just to hear her sing was disappearing into conference rooms and startup culture. And she didn't know how to pull him back. Marquita didn't nag. That wasn't her way. She remembered the man he had been, the man who held her hand under Sunday lights and danced with her in the kitchen at midnight to Motown Records. So she kept sending little prayers up in between grading preschool drawings and running choir rehearsal. She'd text, "Miss you. How did your meeting go?" He'd reply hours later, "Great. You're amazing. Can't wait to come home." She believed him for a while. She'd save him plates after potlucks, write him notes tucked inside his luggage, sing voicemails instead of leaving messages, just a verse of his favorite hymn so he'd feel close to her even from across oceans. Aunt Ebony would say, "Baby, don't love a man who's already gone," but Marquita brushed it off. "He's building something," she would say. "It's just a season." Even when he missed her birthday, she still smiled when his gift arrived, a designer purse and a hand-signed letter. She carried the purse once, then put it away in the closet. It wasn't her. He would have known that, if he'd been there. Still, she waited, and waited, because love, real love, was patient. Right? The first real heartbreak came on Thanksgiving. Ken was supposed to fly home the night before. Marquita had baked his favorite cornbread and even tried to learn how to make Aunt Ebony's sweet potato casserole from scratch. The kids kept asking, "Is Mr. Ken coming? Is he bringing stories from California?" Marquita kept checking her phone. He didn't show. He texted around 2 a.m. "Flight got pushed. So sorry. Will call when I land." He didn't call. That Christmas he sent a voice note from Paris. That New Year he emailed a photo of fireworks from Dubai. He kept missing things. Birthdays, baby dedications, the community awards dinner, where Marquita received recognition for her work with local youth. She sat alone in the back pew one Sunday evening, choir robe draped over the seat next to her where he used to sit. When the service ended, she walked outside and cried in her car. Quiet tears, the kind that hurt your throat more than your eyes, because it wasn't just about missed dates. It was about being forgotten in the parts of life that mattered most. Ken still said "I love you," but it felt mechanical. His texts came later and later. His answers shorter. His warmth distant. Marquita tried to tell herself he was just overwhelmed, but then came the signs she couldn't ignore. Phone calls ending in under a minute. Meetings that ran too late for FaceTime. Cancelled trips without follow-ups. Even when he came home for a surprise weekend, he seemed disconnected. He asked about her preschool job like it was a side hobby. He barely noticed she'd cut her hair. He answered emails at the dinner table and left early Sunday morning before service. That night, Marquita sat on her porch with Aunt Ebony and whispered, "I think he's choosing something else now." Ebony just hugged her. "It's not your fault, baby," she said. "Sometimes love doesn't break with thunder. Sometimes it just fades quietly." Marquita nodded. But deep down, a tiny voice begged, "Please come back to me. Please be who you were." The nausea started on a Monday morning. Marquita blamed it on bad takeout. But it didn't stop. Days passed. Her stomach twisted at random smells. Her energy crashed. Her cycle, regular like clockwork, never came. She bought a test. Then another. Then a third, just to be sure. Each one glowed with the same truth. She was pregnant. She sat on the bathroom floor, hand over her mouth, knees drawn to her chest. Not from fear. Not entirely. But because the timing was cruel. Ken was already gone. Not physically yet, but his absence was thick and real. How could she tell him now? Over text? In a voicemail? Would he even care? She thought about waiting, about pretending it wasn't happening, about holding it in until she could see him again. But deep down she knew. There might not be a next time, so she didn't tell him. Not then. Weeks passed, then months. Ken called less and less. His updates were vague. His affections diluted. One night she stayed up until 3 a.m. waiting for his return call. When it never came, something inside her cracked open. She opened her voice memo app and recorded a message. "Ken," she whispered, "I wanted to tell you something, but I think I don't need to anymore. Not because it isn't important, but because I've finally realized I can't wait for you to come back. I'm having a baby, and I'll love this baby with or without you." She never sent it. Instead, she bought a small crib, painted clouds on the wall of her second bedroom, and started humming lullabies during walks. The moment she heard her baby's heartbeat on the ultrasound, she stopped mourning Ken's absence. She chose motherhood, fully, fiercely, alone. The night Armani was born, it rained. Marquita labored for 14 hours, gripping the rails of the hospital bed and praying between contractions. Aunt Ebony was by her side, whispering scriptures and holding her hand. When Armani came into the world, tiny and warm, she cried, not from pain, but from love that flooded every broken place inside her. He had Ken's jawline, her eyes, a full head of curls. She named him Armani because it meant faith, and faith was all she had left when she chose to bring him into the world. 2 weeks later she brought him to church. The nursery workers cooed over him, calling him a miracle. But Marquita held him close, rocking in the chair by the window, whispering lullabies into his tiny ear. "You are not a secret," she said softly. "You are a gift, and I will never let you feel like you weren't enough." The choir could be heard practicing down the hallway. Marquita hummed along through tears, alone, but never more certain of who she was. Marquita sat frozen in the hospital corridor, the low hum of the vending machine the only sound as her eyes locked onto the screen of her phone. Incoming call, K. Keith. The moment she never thought would come was happening. Her hand trembled as she hit accept. "Hello," she whispered. A pause. Then, "Marquita?" The voice was unmistakable. Deep, familiar, softened by time and surprise. Her heart thundered. For a second she couldn't speak. "Yeah," she finally breathed. "It's me." Ken's tone was cautious but concerned. "I just got a missed call. From this number. Are you okay?" Marquita's eyes burned. She blinked hard, steadying herself. "No, Ken. I'm not okay." He inhaled sharply. "What's going on?" She exhaled slowly. It's about a little boy. His name is Armani." Another pause. Longer this time. Ken's voice lowered. "Marquita, what are you saying?" Her throat tightened. "He's your son." Silence filled the line thicker than before. Ken didn't speak, didn't breathe. Marquita waited, her chest aching. When he finally did speak, his voice was barely above a whisper. "My son." She closed her eyes, pressing her palm against her forehead. "Yes, he's 6. He was born not long after you left." Still, no words came from the other side. Just the soft rustle of background noise, maybe an airport or a hotel lobby. Wherever he was, the world around him had gone still. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice cracked, not with anger, but with disbelief, with pain. "I wanted to," she said, voice trembling. "I almost did, so many times. But you were gone, Ken. You chose your world, and I chose to protect him." Ken cursed under his breath. "Marquita, he's sick," she cut in, tears slipping down her cheeks. "He has aplastic anemia. His body isn't producing blood cells. We tested everyone. There's only one match." She paused. "You—" His breath caught audibly. "Is he going to be okay?" Marquita clutched the edge of the bench. "Not without your help." Ken whispered something she couldn't hear. When he spoke again, his voice was steadier, though shaken. "I need to see him. I need to fix this." Ken stepped outside the terminal gate into the cool California night. He wasn't sure how he made it there. His hands were still shaking, his phone still pressed to his ear even after the call had ended. His son. He had a son. Marquita's voice replayed in his head over and over. "His name is Armani. He's 6. He's yours." He leaned against the concrete wall of the parking garage, his chest tight. So many questions, but one fact burned brighter than them all. Armani was his child, and he had missed everything. The first step, the first word, first day of preschool, first time falling off a bike, every birthday, every hug, every tear wiped from a cheek. His knees weakened under the weight of it, not out of ego but out of heartbreak. He could picture Marquita alone in a hospital room, their son struggling, and all the while he had been half a world away, thinking he had no real ties, no family. Now, the only thing that could save that little boy was running through his veins. Ken pulled out his phone again and looked up flights. No hesitation, no second-guessing. He would be on the next plane out. Back in the hospital hallway, Marquita sat hunched over, staring at the tile floor. She didn't know if he would actually come. People say things in the heat of the moment. But then, her phone buzzed. "New message, Ken Keith. I'm boarding now. First flight to Atlanta. I'll be there before sunrise." She blinked, reading the text 3 times. He was coming. Marquita exhaled sharply, then stood up, pacing again. The doubt in her chest remained, but for the first time in days, something new crept in alongside it. Hope. She walked back into Armani's room. He lay still, a soft beep marking each heartbeat. She leaned down and kissed his forehead. "Your daddy's coming, baby," she whispered. "He's coming for you." After checking on Armani, Marquita slipped away into the hospital's private lounge. She needed to breathe, to think, to feel without breaking down in front of nurses or monitors. Ken was on his way. That was good, wasn't it? But her hands wouldn't stop shaking, her mind wouldn't quiet. Could she really trust him again? The man who once promised her forever had disappeared the moment forever got complicated. Now he wanted to show up in a crisis, be the hero. Her heart warred with itself. She knew this wasn't about them, this was about Armani. His life came first, always. but deep inside the questions burned. Would Ken stay after the surgery? Would he mean it this time, or would he save their son and vanish all over again? Marquita wiped her eyes, took a long breath, and whispered, "God, give me the strength to do what's best, even if it hurts." The door creaked open. Marquita turned. Aunt Ebony stepped in holding a paper bag with a warm cinnamon roll and a bottle of water. "I figured you ain't eaten," she said, settling next to her niece. Marquita smiled faintly. "Thank you." They sat in silence for a minute. Then Ebony asked, "He's coming, isn't he?" Marquita nodded slowly. "Said he's on a plane." Ebony leaned back. "You scared?" Marquita didn't answer right away. "I don't know what to feel," she finally said. "He left without looking back. I was crushed. Now he wants to come save Armani, and part of me is grateful, but the other part—" Her voice broke. Ebony reached over and grabbed her hand. "Baby, nobody said strength means pretending you ain't hurting. It's okay to feel both things, grateful and angry, hopeful and cautious." Marquita blinked through tears. "All I know," Ebony continued, "is that boy in there deserves every chance to live. And if that means letting his father walk through that door, you do it. Not for Ken, not even for you, but for that baby who calls you Mommy." Marquita nodded. "I just want what's best." Ebony kissed her temple. "Then you're already doing it." At 2:43 a.m., the automatic doors of the hospital slid open with a soft hiss. Ken stepped inside. No suit, no briefcase, just jeans, sneakers, and a hoodie pulled tight over his head. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days, because he hadn't. He approached the front desk slowly. "I'm here for Armani Joseph," he said. "His mother is Marquita Joseph. I'm his father." The nurse, startled by the name but professional, buzzed him through. The hallway to the pediatric wing was quiet, dim. Each step echoed in his ears. Then he saw her. Marquita stood outside Armani's room, arms folded, eyes locked on him as he approached. They didn't speak at first, just looked. His chest rose and fell as emotion overtook him. Marquita searched his face. He looked tired, older, but the guilt in his eyes was unmistakable. "I came," he said quietly. "I see that. I'm not leaving," he added. Marquita didn't reply. She stepped aside. Ken walked into the room and saw Armani, small, fragile, fighting. He placed a hand gently on the bed rail, heart crumbling. "Hey, little man," he whispered, voice thick. "I'm here." Ken paused at the doorframe of room 14B. He wasn't ready. Nothing, not the transatlantic flights, not the billions he'd made, not the countless boardroom presentations, could have prepared him for what lay beyond the hospital glass. Inside, curled beneath blankets and surrounded by machines, lay a boy. His boy, Armani. Ken gripped the door handle and inhaled sharply. His feet felt heavy, like gravity doubled in this hallway alone. Through the small window, he could see the 4-line in Armani's tiny arm, the heart monitor pulsing steadily. The boy looked smaller than he had imagined. Fragile, yet still somehow holding on. Marquita stood inside the room, adjusting a pillow near the bed. When she turned and saw him, their eyes met. She nodded once. Ken pushed the door open quietly. Every footstep felt like walking through a memory he never got to make. He stood at the edge of the hospital bed, heart pounding, barely able to breathe. Armani stirred faintly. Ken dropped to his knees, clutching the bed rail. "Hey," he whispered, eyes glistening. I'm your dad." The words nearly undid him. Not from the title, but from the time lost behind it. Marquita stood back, giving Ken space. There was nothing to say, nothing that would matter more than the moment unfolding in front of her. Ken reached out but stopped, afraid to touch. Armani's skin looked too delicate, his breathing too shallow. "Is he asleep?" Ken asked softly. Marquita stepped closer. "He drifts in and out, mostly sleeps." Ken nodded slowly, then lowered himself into the chair beside the bed. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, staring at the little boy who somehow looked so much like him, and so much like her. His fingers brushed against the blanket. "I missed everything," he murmured, barely audible. "I missed his first laugh, his first word. I missed teaching him how to tie his shoes. I wasn't there." Marquita's throat tightened. She wanted to comfort him, but this grief wasn't hers to heal. This was his moment with the son he never knew he had, until now. She turned away, giving him privacy. Ken stayed like that for a long time, whispering things Armani may never hear. But still, he stayed. By morning, Ken had barely moved. Nurses entered quietly to check Armani's vitals. When they asked who he was, Ken stood without hesitation. "I'm his father," he said. Marquita looked at him then, not just with exhaustion or caution, but with a flicker of something else, trust perhaps, or hope. Dr. Fletcher entered the room with a chart tucked under her arm. "You must be Mr. Keith," she said. Ken nodded quickly. "Yes, I want to be tested. Now, anything. Whatever he needs, just tell me what to do." Dr. Fletcher gestured toward the hallway. "We've already run preliminary labs with his records, but we'll confirm everything. Come with me." Marquita watched Ken leave the room, following the doctor down the corridor, walking like a man on a mission. It was the first time she saw him, not as the man who left, but as the man who came back. The memory hit Marquita like a wave as she sat alone in the hospital chair. That day, his last day with her, was etched into her like a scar. It was raining, not just outside, but inside her chest. The sky had been grey for hours, but it wasn't the weather that made her stomach churn. It was the way Ken had been acting for weeks, distant, distracted, unreachable even when he was home. They sat in the living room, quiet. A gospel record played softly in the background. The smell of oven-warmed lasagna still lingered in the air, but the warmth was gone. Ken sat forward, elbows on his knees, counting bills in his hand, nervous habit. "Marquita," he finally said, "I can't keep doing this." She looked up slowly. "Doing what?" "This," he said, voice breaking, "being halfway in, halfway here, halfway there." Her heart dropped. "I love you," he continued, "but I'm failing at everything. I'm losing control of my business. My head's not clear. I don't want to lose you too, so I think it's better if I leave." It hadn't made sense then. It didn't even feel like a breakup, more like a surrender. He kissed her forehead. She clung to his hand until he pulled it free. And then, the door closed. That was the last time she saw him, until now. Later that afternoon, Ken returned to Armani's bedside, blood tests completed, gown removed. He looked exhausted, hollow, but determined. He sat down, same chair, same posture, and held Armani's hand again. The boy stirred. Ken leaned in. "Hey, little man," he whispered. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere, okay?" Armani's eyelids fluttered open. For a second, just a second, his gaze locked on Ken's, and then a smile, small, weak, but unmistakable. Ken's breath caught in his throat. His chest collapsed. He covered his mouth, tears sliding silently down his face as he leaned forward and gently kissed his son's hand. Marquita stood in the doorway, arms crossed over her heart, tears slipping down her cheeks too. She didn't move. She didn't interrupt. She just let the moment belong to them. Because it did. That night, the hospital chapel was empty except for flickering battery-operated candles and soft music playing from a small speaker. Marquita sat in the second row, staring at the cross on the wall. Ken walked in quietly and sat beside her. Neither spoke for a while. Finally, Ken broke the silence. "I deserved worse than silence, but thank you for letting me come." Marquita stared ahead. "It wasn't about you, it was about Armani." He nodded. "I know." Another pause. "I thought building something big would fix the guilt, would fill the void. But it just made it louder," Ken said quietly. Marquita glanced sideways. "Why didn't you come back?" "I was scared," he admitted. "Scared I'd ruin everything. Scared I wasn't enough." She let out a breath that had been stuck in her chest all day. "I cried every night for a year," she said. "Then I stopped, because I had someone else to fight for." Ken turned to her. "You did better than I ever could have." Marquita blinked. "I didn't want to do it alone." A silence hung between them, but this one didn't hurt. It healed. They left the chapel together and walked back to Armani's room. The hallways were quiet. It was almost midnight. Marquita stopped outside the door and turned to Ken. "You know," she said, "this isn't going to be easy. I know. There will be days I still don't trust you. I deserve that." She looked at him, eyes fierce and tired. "Then why are you really here, Ken?" He stepped closer, voice steady. "Because I'm not leaving again." She didn't say anything right away, but she didn't walk away either. She turned and opened the door. They entered the room together, two people with too much history, too much hurt, and just maybe enough hope to start again. The next morning arrived cloaked in a heavy silence. Inside the hospital's pre-op wing, Ken changed into a thin blue gown. The 4-line was already in his arm. A nurse adjusted the monitoring strap on his wrist while reviewing the checklist. Marquita stood just outside the curtain divider, watching as Ken sat on the edge of the hospital bed. For a man who'd once graced Forbes's 40 under 40, he looked like any other nervous father about to undergo something he couldn't fully control. Dr. Fletcher entered, clipboard in hand, expression neutral but focused. "You'll be under anesthesia for the extraction," she explained. "We'll take bone marrow from your pelvic bone using a needle. You'll be sore afterward, possibly weak for a few days, but you should recover without complications." Ken nodded. "No hesitation?" she asked, double-checking his chart. "None," he said. Marquita finally stepped in, brushing a loose lock from her eyes. Ken looked up at her. "I don't care what it takes. He's my son." For the first time, Marquita didn't flinch when he said it. Before the procedure, Ken asked for just 5 minutes alone with Armani. They wheeled his gurney into the pediatric ICU, 4 still attached. Nurses and staff gave them space as Ken scooted close to Armani's bed. Marquita stood in the doorway, watching silently. Ken reached for Armani's small hand. His son stirred but didn't open his eyes fully. "Hey, little man," Ken whispered. "I'm going to take a nap for a bit. Doctors say it'll help you feel better. So while I'm doing that, I need you to keep being strong. Deal?" Armani didn't speak, but his fingers curled slightly around Ken's. Ken's throat closed up. He blinked fast to keep his composure. "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner," he continued. "But I'm here now, and I promise, I'm not going anywhere again." He kissed Armani's hand gently and looked over at Marquita. "I'll see you after," he said. She nodded. "We'll be right here." Ken allowed the nurse to wheel him out, but before the door shut, he called back softly. "Tell him I love him." Marquita placed a hand over her heart. "He knows." As Ken lay still under the pre-op lights, anesthesia not yet administered, his mind drifted back to a memory he had buried for years. His mother. She had met Marquita once. Only once. It was during a short trip Ken took to his hometown in Connecticut, bringing Marquita along for what he'd hoped would be a weekend of peace. Instead, it became a mirror reflecting every fracture between the world he came from and the life he had chosen with her. They'd arrived at his childhood home. Spacious, colonial style, prim with porcelain everything. His mother, Lorraine Keith, opened the door, her pearls resting stiff against her collarbone. "Ken," she said, all smiles. Then her eyes moved to Marquita. A beat too long. Marquita extended a hand, polite. "It's nice to meet you, ma'am." Lorraine shook it, but with the kind of caution that didn't need words. Later that night, as Marquita helped set the table, Ken overheard his mother in the hallway on the phone. "She's nice, but not a fit darling. You know the circles you run in, the investors, the people who'll question your judgment." Ken didn't confront her. He didn't defend Marquita either. He carried that silence like a wound. Now, as he lay waiting for the doctors, the memory stung deeper. He should have stood up then. He wouldn't make the same mistake again. In the operating prep room, final tests were underway. Ken's vitals were strong, white blood cell count normal. No signs of complications. Dr. Fletcher reviewed the latest labs one last time before turning to the nurse beside her. "He's a green light," she said. Ken was quiet but focused as they explained the next steps. The nurse adjusted the flow on his 4-drip, and the anesthesiologist prepared the sedation. "You'll go under in a few minutes," the doctor said. "You won't feel a thing during the procedure." Ken nodded. "Good." As they inserted the oxygen cannula and prepared the sedatives, he asked one last question. "When will he receive it?" Dr. Fletcher answered, "Later today. Once we process the marrow, if his body accepts it, we'll know within 48 hours. Ken closed his eyes. "Let's save him." And then the anesthesia began to pull him under. The surgical room went still as the procedure began. Ken lay on his side, unconscious, while the doctors carefully guided the large hollow needle into his pelvic bone. Every motion was deliberate. Every glance between the surgeons communicated urgency, precision, and focus. 2 nurses monitored vitals. A third handled the collection tubes, thick, clear bags where Ken's marrow would slowly fill, golden red and vital. Meanwhile, Marquita waited outside the surgical unit, pacing in small circles. She clutched Armani's sketchbook to her chest. He had drawn stars and suns before getting too weak to color between the lines. Her mind was a storm. What if Ken's body didn't produce enough? What if something went wrong in the transfer? What if Armani's body rejected it? She dropped her head against the wall and whispered under her breath, "God, I've done all I can." Inside the operating room, The bags continued to fill. Finally, the lead doctor looked up. "We've got enough." Ken was wheeled into the recovery ward, pale and groggy. He blinked slowly, trying to speak, but the words came out slurred. Marquita was already at his side. She pulled the blanket tighter around him and sat down beside the bed. "You did it," she whispered. "You did what only you could." Ken nodded faintly, his breathing labored. "How is he?" "They're prepping the marrow now," she said. "They'll transfuse it soon." She reached for his hand. "Rest. I'll stay here." She watched him close his eyes again, exhaustion swallowing him whole. Then she quietly stepped away and slipped back into the hospital chapel. She knelt, and for the first time since the diagnosis, she didn't ask for a miracle. She gave thanks. "Thank you for sending him back," she whispered. "Thank you for saving our son. Let your will be done." Hours later, the doctors completed the transfusion. Ken was still asleep, resting heavily in recovery. Marquita sat at Armani's side as the new marrow began to flow into his bloodstream through the foreline. The room was dim, filled with quiet beeps and soft footsteps. A nurse checked the monitor, then smiled gently. "His body isn't rejecting it." Marquita's breath caught. "What does that mean?" "It's early," the nurse said, "but it's a good start. His vitals are holding steady. This is the best response we could have hoped for." Marquita's knees nearly gave out. She grabbed the side of the bed, tears filling her eyes. She looked down at Armani's peaceful face, cheeks still pale but no longer ghostly. "You're doing it, baby," she whispered. "You're fighting. You're winning." In the hallway, Aunt Ebony stood watching, and down the corridor, Ken stirred. Their journey wasn't over, but for the first time in weeks, there was light ahead. The hospital corridor had gone still. Monitors beeped faintly from rooms on either side, but in Armani's room, time itself seemed to pause. Moonlight filtered through the blinds, casting soft lines across the floor. Ken sat on the edge of the pull-out chair, his back slightly hunched, eyes heavy with more than just fatigue. Marquita stood by the window, arms folded, her eyes distant yet alert, a posture she'd mastered over 7 years of single motherhood. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Finally, Ken's voice broke the silence, low and hoarse. "He's so small, but so strong." Marquita turned slightly. "He's had to be—" Her voice wasn't sharp, just tired. Worn from praying through nights alone, from navigating a life that was never supposed to look like this. She didn't blame him, not out loud, but the unspoken words hung thick in the air. Ken looked over at her. "I've replayed everything, you know. Every moment I should have stayed, should have asked more questions, should have loved better." Marquita didn't turn this time. Her eyes lingered on the sky beyond the window. "It's quiet here at night. That's when the pain gets the loudest." He swallowed hard. "I want to talk about it. All of it." She finally looked at him, her arms slowly dropping to her sides. "Then talk," Ken exhaled, leaning back and staring at the ceiling tiles. "I was scared, Marquita. I know that sounds weak, but it's the truth. I was building the company from scratch. Every investor I met looked at me like I had to prove I didn't lose focus, especially when I started bringing you around." Marquita furrowed her brow. "What does that mean?" He hesitated. "My world. It's full of men who think love is a liability. They whispered behind my back, said I was losing my edge, and when I told my mother about you—" Her expression shifted. "Ah," she said, "it would never work. That you were a distraction. Too different." Marquita's voice cracked. "Different, or not white enough." Ken's silence was its own confession. "She didn't even try to know you, and I was a coward. I let her fear become mine." He rubbed his face with both hands. "But walking away from you, it broke something in me, and I didn't even know I'd left behind my own blood." Marquita clenched her fists at her side, jaw tight. "You didn't just leave me. You left Armani before he ever took his first breath." Marquita took a step forward, her voice trembling but firm. "I remember standing in my mama's kitchen, holding a test that changed my whole world. I tried calling you that night, twice. No answer." Ken closed his eyes. "I told myself you were just busy. But then days turned to weeks, and silence became my reality. I didn't have the luxury to cry for long. I had to be somebody's mama." Her voice wavered. "I watched Armani fight colds, asthma, bruised knees, and now this. A disease I can't hug away. A sickness I can't sing over." She stepped closer, eyes glassy. You don't know what it's like watching your baby wither while you pray God don't take him in his sleep. Ken's lips parted, but no words came. There were none strong enough to answer that. I'm not asking for an apology, she added, because forgiveness isn't a debt you pay. It's a choice I have to make, but if we're going to move forward. She paused, voice trembling. I need the whole truth, all of it, not just business excuses or Mama's opinions. Ken nodded slowly. You deserve that, and I'll give it. Every bit. Silence blanketed the room again, but this time it wasn't heavy, it was sacred. Marquita slowly reached for the chair opposite him and sat down. She looked at her palms. I asked God for strength to keep going, but I never asked him to make you come back. Maybe I was scared of what that would mean. Ken's voice cracked. And now? I don't know, but watching you show up, stay, go through the pain of that surgery, it told me more than any words. He looked down, biting the inside of his cheek to stay composed. I don't expect you to trust me yet, but I'm asking for the chance to earn it. Marquita let out a long breath. You want to be his father. With everything I have left, a single tear escaped her eye. Then be better. Not for me, for Armani. Ken nodded slowly. That's a promise. She looked away, her voice whisper soft. Forgiveness doesn't erase pain, but maybe it makes space for healing. Ken reached across, gently taking her hand. Then let's start there. They sat in stillness, hands lightly clasped between them. The hum of Armani's monitor was the only thing anchoring them to the present. For a moment Marquita looked over at her son, his tiny chest rising and falling, cheeks slightly flushed with a new warmth that hadn't been there before the transplant. Marquita smiled faintly. He gets that from me. Ken chuckled softly. That's true. They both laughed quietly, the first shared laugh in years. It didn't feel forced. It felt necessary. Marquita turned back to him, her expression softening. Thank you, for not walking away this time. Ken stood up slowly, leaned over to her, and paused, eyes asking a question without words. She nodded slightly. He leaned in and pressed a kiss to her forehead. It was tender, lingering, and spoke volumes more than any apology ever could. Marquita closed her eyes. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was doing this alone. Later that night, Ken had dozed off in the recliner beside Armani's bed, his hand gently resting on their son's. Marquita sat by the window again, her Bible open on her lap, but her gaze settled on her sleeping child. Tears welled in her eyes, not from sadness, from awe. She began humming, low and full. The familiar melody filled the room like a lullaby stitched into her soul. Great is thy faithfulness, O God, my Father. Her voice was soft, but the words carried weight. Years of prayers, of lonely nights, of strength born from necessity. There is no shadow of turning with thee. Ken stirred gently, opening his eyes. He didn't speak. He just watched her, his eyes glistening. Thou changest not, thy compassions they fail not. Marquita stood slowly, moving closer to Armani's bedside. As thou hast been, thou forever wilt be. She ran her fingers through Armani's curls, the song still flowing from her lips, calm, steady, unwavering. Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me. The last note lingered in the air like a promise, not just for Armani's healing, but for restoration, reconciliation, and the miracle of love that refused to quit. Ken never left Armani's side. The sterile walls of the children's oncology ward had become a second home. Days turned to weeks, and Ken found himself adjusting to a rhythm he never imagined. Morning rounds, with doctors, quiet moments beside Armani's hospital bed, late-night prayer circles with Marquita and nurses, it all became part of his daily breath. He kept a change of clothes in his SUV, showered in the hospital's family facilities, and worked remotely when he could. His laptop sat open on the side table, but more often than not, it remained untouched. Emails could wait. Armani couldn't. Ken had built billion-dollar deals, traveled across continents, and stood in rooms where people worshipped him for his business mind. But nothing compared to sitting in a folding chair beside his son, watching that small chest rise and fall. Some nights, when Marquita dozed off on the pull-out cot, Ken would stay up just listening to Armani's breathing. He didn't know fatherhood would look like this, sleepless, sacred, and painfully beautiful. Each hour he remained there, chipped away at the man who left 7 years ago, and slowly, something stronger was rebuilding in its place. Ken wasn't much of a musician, but he remembered Armani's chart had said something about soothing music helping with rest and anxiety. So, one afternoon, after a particularly hard round of tests, Ken sat beside the bed and pulled out his phone. "You ever heard Sam Cooke?" he asked softly, glancing over to where Armani lay, eyes closed but awake. The boy didn't answer, but Ken hit play anyway. "A Change Is Gonna Come" drifted through the room, soft and rich. Ken watched Armani's fingers twitch to the rhythm, a small, barely there response, but it was enough. Over the next few days, music became their bond. Ken curated a playlist of jazz, soul, gospel, and even a few lullabies. Sometimes he'd hum along, off-key and clumsy, but heartfelt. He brought a small Bluetooth speaker and made a point to play songs Armani might recognize from TV or cartoons. On good days, Armani would blink a little longer, like he was trying to hold on to the sound. One evening, Marquita walked in to find Ken sitting with headphones on Armani, softly mouthing the words to "Stand By Me." She paused at the doorway, her eyes misting. The man who once disappeared without a word was now playing backup singer to their son's healing. Ken didn't just sit around playing music. When he saw the stack of paperwork on Marquita's lap one morning, bills, insurance denials, confusing medical forms, he asked, "Do you want help?" She hesitated, then nodded. It took him less than an hour to get the billing office to reverse a coding error that had denied a crucial test. He called the insurance company himself, got escalated to supervisors, and within a day, pre-approvals for experimental treatment options were back on the table. Ken was relentless, but polite, firm but not condescending. Watching him navigate the system that had overwhelmed her for years left Marquita speechless. He even donated anonymously to the hospital's family fund, covering hotel stays for out off-town parents. "I can't change what I missed," he told her quietly, "but I can make sure you don't carry this burden alone anymore." For the first time, Marquita began to wonder if maybe this version of Ken had always been there, just buried beneath fear and pride. He wasn't polished anymore. Gone were the cufflinks, the stiff posture, the corporate armor. This Ken wore soft sweatshirts, unshaven stubble, and exhaustion like a badge of honor. And yet, he had never looked more human, or more beautiful. Marquita watched him gently adjust Armani's blanket one night, whispering to him like a lullaby. She watched him push Armani's four-pole with awkward care when they strolled the hallway for light movement. There was no performance, no pretense. Just a man finally meeting his moment. It cracked something open in her. Ken noticed her watching once and chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "What? Do I got toothpaste on my shirt?" She smiled softly. "No, just wasn't expecting you to look so different." "Good different," he teased. "Surprising," she admitted. In a good way. She didn't say more, but something unspoken passed between them. A fragile peace, a beginning. Healing doesn't always happen in big, dramatic waves. Sometimes, it looks like two people sharing burnt coffee from a hospital vending machine at 6 a.m., trading soft jokes to survive another day. Marquita laughed, really laughed, when Ken spilled creamer on his hoodie and blamed the cup. "It attacked me," he said with mock seriousness, dabbing himself with a paper towel. "You're lucky Armani's asleep," she replied, giggling. "He'd never let you live that down." They found pockets of normalcy in shared crossword puzzles, quick card games, and even arguing over who made the worst hospital eggs. Ken began to understand something deeper. Marquita wasn't just Armani's mother. She was strong, witty, intelligent, and utterly disarming. He looked at her one morning and whispered to himself, "What was I thinking, walking away?" The peace didn't last. On a quiet Wednesday afternoon, the door to Armani's room opened gently. Marquita looked up from her devotional, and there she stood. Lorraine Whitmore, Ken's mother, elegant, cold, dressed in pearls and judgment. Ken stood quickly. "Mom?" Lorraine's eyes swept the room, from Armani's bed to Marquita's chair, and rested on her son. "I heard what happened," she said flatly. "You should have told me sooner." Ken stepped toward her, tension already building. "I didn't think you'd want to come." "He's my grandson." Her gaze shifted sharply to Marquita. "I have a right to know him." Marquita rose slowly, calm but firm. "He doesn't know you. Let's not make this about rights." The air grew heavy. Lorraine tightened her grip on her purse strap. "I hope you haven't filled his head with ideas about me." Ken stepped between them. "Mom, not here." Marquita didn't blink. "It's fine. Let her stay. Let's all see who she really is." And with that, the first crack of the old storm broke open, a reckoning long overdue. Lorraine Owens didn't knock when she entered the hospital room. Her Chanel scarf still clung to her shoulder-length blonde hair, and her heels clicked with the authority of someone who never questioned their place in the world. Armani was asleep, hooked to machines, and Marquita sat beside him with a folded blanket over her lap and gospel music playing softly from her phone. "You really have no shame, do you?" Lorraine's voice was low but edged in venom. Marquita turned slowly, trying to mask the sting that crept up her spine. "Excuse me?" "You kept this child from my son for 6 years," Lorraine said, eyes scanning the room with contempt. "And now, conveniently, you pop up when he needs to save him." Marquita stood, not wanting to raise her voice near Armani. "I didn't ask for any of this. I never wanted it to be like this." Lorraine's lips curled. "Right. You just wanted him back, and what better way than using a sick child to force his hand?" Marquita's eyes welled, but she refused to let a tear fall. "You don't know me, and you don't know what it's been like raising a child alone. This isn't a game. This is Armani's life." "Exactly," Lorraine snapped. "And Ken has everything to lose if he gets tied up with you again. His image, his company. You think this is some fairy tale reunion? It's not." Marquita clenched her hands together, praying for strength. Not for herself, but for her son, who lay inches away. The door had been cracked open. Ken stepped inside slowly, eyes flickering between his mother and Marquita. "That's enough, Mom." Lorraine whirled around. "Kenny, I was just trying to make her understand what's at stake." "No," Ken said firmly. "You were trying to humiliate the mother of my child." Marquita stiffened. It was the first time he said it out loud. "She kept him from you," Lorraine pressed. "No," Ken cut in. "I left. I stopped calling. I made those choices. She did what she thought was best." Lorraine shook her head, her voice rising. "So you're going to throw away everything you built for a woman who lied to you?" Ken stepped closer to Marquita, standing beside her. "What I almost threw away was a chance to know my son, a chance to do right by him. And if you can't support that, then maybe it's time we had some distance." His words stunned Lorraine. Her mouth parted, but no response came. Her son had never spoken to her that way. "Distance?" she gasped. "You'd cut off your own mother for her?" Ken ran a hand down his face. "It's not about cutting anyone off. It's about boundaries. It's about respect. I raised you to have standards, Ken, to stay focused, to be the best." "And I am," he replied. "But not if I ignore the people I love, not if I let fear and pride keep me from my son, or from the woman who gave everything to protect him." Marquita took a step back, giving them space, but Lorraine turned her fury toward her. "You poisoned him against me." "No, Mom," Ken said, stepping in. "You did that yourself, and if you can't see how wrong this is, maybe you need to leave." There was silence. Deep, awkward, the kind that burned in your chest. Lorraine looked at Armani one last time, shook her head, and walked out without another word. The room was still, tense. Marquita turned to Ken, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is exactly why I didn't want to call you." Ken stared at her, confused. "What? This drama, this pressure. I didn't want to bring this mess into Armani's life." "You didn't," Ken said. "Yes, I did," she replied, backing away. "I didn't want to complicate things. He's just a child. He deserves peace, not power struggles and insults." Ken tried to reach for her hand, but she pulled away. "Marquita, please, don't do this again. Don't walk away." She swallowed. "I'm just trying to protect my son." Ken gently held her arm, pulling her back toward him. "You've been protecting him alone for too long," he said softly. "Let me help now. Let me protect both of you." Marquita looked up, eyes glossy. "You said that once before." He nodded. "And I failed. But not again." They stood there, close, the sound of the heart monitor humming beside them. The lights dimmed, the hallway quiet. Ken turned toward the hallway where a few nurses watched, whispering about what just happened. He raised his voice just enough. "This woman is not a mistake. She's the mother of my son, and she is my family." The nurses turned away politely, pretending not to listen, but everyone heard it. Everyone. Marquita stood frozen. Ken turned to her fully. "I know I messed up. I know I don't deserve instant forgiveness, but I'm here. I'm staying. And I'm claiming what's mine." His voice trembled. "You, Armani, this second chance. That's my family. That's final." Marquita didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. Her tears said enough. She walked back to Armani's bedside, sat down slowly, and reached out her hand. Ken took it. Outside, a quiet storm rolled in over Atlanta. But inside that hospital room, something finally felt calm. The sterile scent of antiseptic no longer overwhelmed Marquita when she walked into Armani's hospital room. It was becoming more like a second home. But this morning, as she stepped in and caught sight of her son seated upright with a soft blanket across his lap and a weak smile touching the corners of his mouth, something shifted inside her. Her knees nearly gave out. "Hey, Mama," Armani said in a faint, raspy tone. Tears gathered in Marquita's eyes. She rushed to his side and kissed his forehead gently. "Hey, baby, look at you. You're sitting up." Armani nodded slightly, his face pale but his spirit clearer than it had been in weeks. The transplant was taking. The blood counts were stabilizing. The dark cloud that had threatened to crush her family seemed to be lifting, one lab result at a time. Ken stood just behind her, quietly holding a paper cup of warm apple juice. He had been at the hospital every single day since the transplant, helping in small ways that mattered, bringing Armani's favorite cartoons on his tablet, sitting through every blood draw, answering doctor questions when Marquita's brain was too tired to think. "Doc says his counts are looking better than they expected," Ken said softly. Marquita blinked, overwhelmed. "God, I thank you." Armani gave a little chuckle. "Is Mr. Ken gonna cry again?" Ken chuckled, wiping the corner of his eye with the back of his hand. "Might." They all laughed. For the first time in months, it wasn't a forced smile. It was hope breathing on dry bones. Armani still had a long road ahead, but he was alive, and getting stronger. Later that week, the sound of familiar laughter filled the children's ward. Members from Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church had come bearing food, prayer, and the kind of joy that only a tight-knit faith community could bring. Miss Yvette from the choir brought sweet potato pie in a pink-topped Tupperware. Brother Ellis dropped off a handwritten prayer journal wrapped in blue ribbon. Children from the youth group sent drawings with rainbows, crosses, and "We love you, Armani" in crayon. Marquita smiled through grateful tears. She stood with her arms around Armani, who was now sitting in a wheelchair near the window, watching everyone. He looked thin but alert. Ken stood by awkwardly, not quite sure where to position himself. Pastor Hampton approached him with a warm but cautious nod. "Mr. Keith, good to finally meet you. I hear you've been here around the clock." Ken extended a hand, humbled. "Please, just Ken. And yes, I couldn't be anywhere else." The pastor glanced toward Armani, then back at Ken. A father's presence matters. From a distance, Marquita watched the two men, feeling emotions swirl inside her. Acceptance wasn't instant, but the roots were being planted. Her community was watching, measuring Ken not by Armani's bloodline, but by the choices Ken made now. On Sunday afternoon, Ken joined Marquita at the hospital chapel's weekly devotion hour. She wore a simple lavender cardigan, her Bible resting on her lap. He sat beside her, a little stiff, a little out of place, but trying. When Sister Maybelle broke into leaning on the everlasting arms, Marquita joined in harmony. Her voice was low but strong, a reminder of who she'd always been, even in the valley. Ken couldn't sing, not really, but he followed the lyrics on the screen, tapping his foot in quiet rhythm. The simplicity of it all, the clapping hands, the tambourines, the testimonies of survival, it pierced through the layers of boardrooms and balance sheets that once shielded him from vulnerability. That night, he helped Marquita update Armani's medication tracker. He even read through her insurance paperwork, flagging outdated policy coverage and calling in a favor with his company's legal department to help resolve a billing discrepancy. "Why are you doing all this?" she asked quietly. Ken looked at her, eyes steady. "Because I should have been here, all along." He was learning the rhythm of her life, faith-based, community-anchored, deeply sacrificial, and though he still felt like a guest in her world, he was ready to earn his stay. The hospital kitchen wasn't exactly state-of-the-art, but it had a working stove, a fridge, and enough counter space for Ken to slice vegetables while Marquita stirred her famous collard greens. They were making Armani's favorite, chicken soup with cornbread on the side. As they moved around each other in the small kitchen, their elbows brushing and laughter rising, it felt like a glimpse of a life they never got to build. Comfortable, cooperative, domestic, in the most sacred way. "Okay, Mr. Wall Street," Marquita teased, handing him a spoon. "Taste this and be honest." Ken dipped it, blew gently, and closed his eyes as the flavor hit. "That's not soup, that's gospel in a bowl." She laughed so hard she almost dropped the cornbread pan. Later, back in Armani's room, they curled up on either side of his bed with an old children's Bible between them, taking turns reading aloud. Armani drifted off to sleep with his parents on each side, his mother softly humming, his father gently brushing back his curls. A few days later, as they sat on a bench in the hospital courtyard with sun cutting through clouds, Ken pulled out a folder. Inside was a proposal he'd spent all night working on. Marquita flipped through it slowly. "The Joy House? I remembered what you said," Ken explained. "You wanted a space where kids could learn gospel music, find their voices, stay off the streets. This would be in West Atlanta. Local instructors, after-school program, full scholarship for underprivileged families." She looked up at him, heart thudding. "I don't want this to be a handout," Ken said. "I want it to be a foundation, with your name on it, your leadership. I just want to help build it." Marquita's hands trembled. No one had ever believed in her vision like this, not in a way that included paperwork, budget outlines, and zoning permits. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. Ken shrugged with a half-smile. "You already did. I'm just finally listening." That night, as the nurses dimmed the hallway lights and the machines hummed softly, Marquita stepped outside Armani's room to find Ken asleep on the hallway bench, jacket folded under his head. She stood for a long moment watching him. This man who had once vanished and now returned with steady hands, soft words and daily presence. He hadn't asked for forgiveness with grand gestures. He'd earned her trust inch by inch. Marquita knelt beside him, brushing a curl away from his forehead. His eyes fluttered open. "You should have gone home," she said. Ken blinked, sat up slowly. "Couldn't leave, not when you and Armani are here." Silence wrapped around them. "I'm scared," she admitted, "to open that door again. But I'm also tired of guarding it." He reached for her hand. "Then let me hold it open. I won't walk through unless you say so." Marquita exhaled. The pain hadn't vanished, but love was finding its way again. She leaned in and whispered, "We'll take it slow." Ken nodded. Slow is perfect, and just like that, healing began. It was Armani's idea, oddly enough. He was the one who looked up from his coloring book and asked, "Can we go somewhere with trees, like big trees and water?" Marquita had blinked at him, caught off guard. "What kind of water? Like a lake, where you can breathe," he said softly. Ken, standing nearby with a bottle of Ensure in one hand and his phone in the other, locked eyes with her. It was the same thing she hadn't said out loud for weeks. "We need air." 3 days later, they were bundled in coats, stepping out of Ken's SUV onto a quiet lakeside cabin just an hour outside of Atlanta. The property belonged to a friend of Ken's who owed him a favor, but for this weekend, it was their sanctuary. The crisp, pine-scented air hit Marquita first. She closed her eyes and inhaled deeply. Armani grinned from the back seat. "This don't smell like no hospital." Inside, the cabin was warm, rustic, and surprisingly cozy. Wood panels lined the walls, a stone fireplace crackled in the corner, and 3 oversized blankets lay folded neatly on a rocking chair by the window. They spent the first evening roasting marshmallows over the fireplace, with Armani giggling every time Ken dropped one into the flames. They watched a family movie together, and later, while Armani dozed off, Ken sat beside Marquita on the porch swing under a blanket, both of them sipping tea in silence. The stillness was healing. The noise of the world had fallen away. It wasn't about titles, surgeries, or past mistakes. It was just the 3 of them, letting their lungs stretch and hearts breathe again. The second day brought a lazy morning. Armani was napping in the master room, with the sun pouring in over his curled body like a soft quilt. Marquita and Ken walked down a quiet dirt path that led to the edge of the lake. The breeze was gentle, and the surface of the water shimmered like glass. They reached a small wooden dock. She sat, shoes off, toes dangling just above the surface. Ken sat beside her, his shoulder brushing hers. It was here, on a dock just like this one, 6 years ago during a college retreat, that they'd had their first real conversation about dreams, about gospel choirs and tech startups, about hope. That night, they'd kissed under the stars. Now, they sat in similar silence, older, scarred, and changed. "You remember the retreat?" Ken asked, voice low. Marquita nodded, her eyes distant with memory. "You wore that ugly hoodie that said, 'Tech bros do it better.'" Ken laughed. "And you told me I had no rhythm. You didn't. I still don't." They both smiled, but the moment hung suspended between them. Marquita turned slightly, her eyes searching his. I've made peace with who I was, Ken said gently. But I never stopped wishing I'd grown up sooner. Back then. Maybe then. She reached for his hand. Ken leaned in. Slowly. No urgency, no need. Just presence. Their lips touched like a promise rediscovered. Not a spark, but a fire rekindled. Gentle. True. A kiss that said, I remember. I forgive. And maybe I'm ready. Later that evening, they sat by the fireplace after Armani had fallen asleep again, wrapped up in one of the soft flannel blankets. Ken had made hot cocoa from scratch, burned the first batch, redeemed the second. Marquita leaned against him barefoot, her heart strangely at peace. Ken cleared his throat. I want to show you something. From his coat pocket, he pulled out a small black velvet box, not a ring, but a locket. He opened it slowly. On one side was a photo of Armani smiling up at the camera, cheeks chubby and eyes bright. On the other side was a tiny inscription. The family I never stopped praying for. Marquita covered her mouth. I'm not asking for a wedding, Ken said gently. Not now, maybe not even this year. I'm asking for another chance to show up. Every morning, every hard day, every good one. He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. If the time ever comes that you feel ready, I'll be here. No pressure, no deadline, just here. The fire crackled in response. Marquita reached for the locket, her fingers trembling. Her eyes didn't leave his as she whispered, Thank you for not rushing me. Ken nodded. Second chances take time. They didn't speak about the locket again that night. Instead, they cleaned up quietly, shared sleepy glances, and helped Armani back into bed when he stirred. In the morning, they made pancakes together. Armani covered his with blueberries and syrup, and Ken let him. Later, as they packed their things and loaded the car to return to the city, Marquita stood by the lake one last time. Ken walked up behind her, hands in his pockets. I meant everything I said last night, he offered softly. She turned, looked him square in the eye. I know. He waited. She reached up, touched the edge of his collar, then smiled, soft, unsure, but open. Let's take it one prayer at a time. He exhaled slowly. That was more than he'd hoped for. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no either, and sometimes maybe it was the most honest kind of beginning. That night, back in Armani's hospital room, now brighter with balloons and cards and a fresh sense of possibility, Marquita gathered both Ken and Armani by the bed. Let's pray, she said, quietly but firmly. Ken had never been comfortable praying out loud, but he bowed his head without hesitation. Marquita held one of Armani's hands and reached for Ken's with the other. Lord, she began, we don't have all the answers, but we thank you for bringing us this far, for healing our son, for opening closed doors, and for softening hearts that were once too afraid to love again. Her voice cracked, but she kept going. Teach us how to be a family, the kind that listens, forgives, and fights for each other. Help us not to run from the hard things, but to face them with grace. She paused. Ken added quietly, and help me never take this second chance for granted. Armani whispered, Amen. 3 voices, 1 fragile prayer. In that moment, heaven didn't need loud declarations or grand gestures. It just needed that quiet whisper of surrender. A family, rebuilt, rewoven, still unsure, but finally praying together. 6 months had passed since the day Armani's body accepted the transplant. The hospital room that once echoed with machines and quiet sobs now only lived in memory. Today, Armani stood tall, his little feet dancing across the living room floor of Marquita's modest Atlanta home, chasing the light from the window with a giggle that made her heart ache with gratitude. His cheeks were fuller, color returned to his skin, and his voice, once faint, now carried like wind through summer trees. The doctors had declared him in full remission just 2 weeks ago, and since then it was like watching him bloom daily. Marquita knelt down to tie his shoes as he prepared for his first day back at his community preschool. Mama, can Daddy come too? Armani asked, eyes bright, holding his Spider-Man backpack. She paused, smiled softly, and nodded. He'll meet us there, baby. And he did. Ken pulled up minutes later, no longer the polished CEO in sharp suits, but a man softened by humility. A simple hoodie and jeans, a lunchbox in one hand, a juice pouch in the other. Super Dad, Marquita teased. He leaned over to ruffle Armani's curls. Anything for my boy. They walked into the preschool like any other family. No headlines, no cameras. Just 2 parents, finally walking in rhythm for their child. Co-parenting had been awkward at first. clumsy schedules, late-night calls to clarify medications, and shared responsibility for every scraped knee and giggle fit. But over time, it settled into something beautiful. Ken had learned to let go of his boardroom instincts when it came to parenting. He no longer tried to fix things with money or strategy. Now, he simply showed up. For story time, for peanut butter sandwiches, for 2 a.m. fevers. Marquita no longer held back every emotion either. The walls she'd built, from pain, abandonment and survival, had started to crack. Not because Ken demanded it, but because he earned it. One evening they sat in Marquita's backyard under a string of dollar store lights. Armani slept upstairs, and the air smelled like summer rain. "You know," she began, fingers curled around a warm mug, "I never thought I'd co-parent. I thought I'd do this all alone, forever." Ken looked over. "You shouldn't have had to." That night, they didn't kiss. But when Ken reached over and took her hand, she didn't pull away. It started as a vision scribbled in a church bulletin, Faith Sounds, a school for gospel music and community healing. Marquita had always loved music. It was her mother's lullaby, her own survival song through heartbreak, and her praise during Armani's darkest nights. When Armani got stronger, she began to hum more again. Then sing, then dream. 6 months later, she stood in a refurbished church annex, ribbon in hand, Armani by her side. A small crowd of neighbors, church family and students gathered. She cut the ribbon with tears in her eyes. Inside, the school had 2 practice rooms, a small choir rehearsal space and a modest office. Children from all over the neighborhood, some from broken homes, some from shelters, now had a safe place to sing, learn piano, write their truth in rhythm. The school became a beacon of soul and community, not fancy, not flashy, but holy in its purpose, and it was all hers, or so she thought. One late evening, Marquita was filing invoices when her pastor, Reverend Gillespie, stopped by to deliver documents she'd left at the church. He lingered with a smile. "You never did find out who covered that second phase of renovation, huh?" Marquita looked up, curious. "What do you mean? I thought it was the grant from the city." Reverend Gillespie chuckled and handed her an envelope. Inside was a donor letter from the Owens Tech Foundation. She stared at the signature, Kenneth J. Owens. Speechless, Marquita sat down, heart thudding. Ken hadn't said a word. No press release, no grand reveal, just quiet support, through a foundation that once funded STEM scholarships, now writing checks for a gospel school in a South Atlanta neighborhood. Later that night, she confronted him outside her porch. "You could have told me." He shrugged, eyes sincere. "I didn't want you to feel like I was buying a piece of your dream. I just wanted to be part of something you believed in." Her throat tightened. "You didn't have to." "I know, but I wanted to, and I always will." Weeks after the grand opening, Armani performed in his first choir recital. The church pews were filled. Ken arrived early, holding a camcorder like a proud dad. Marquita was in the front row, trembling, not from nerves, but from everything she had kept bottled up for years. After the children sang, she stepped to the mic and paused, her eyes locked with Ken's across the room. "This song," she said, voice slightly shaking, "is about second chances. Not just the kind that fall into your lap, but the kind that rise from forgiveness, time and grace." Then she sang. Not with perfection, but with depth, with faith. Afterward, as the crowd dispersed, Ken approached her slowly, not with assumption, but with intention. "I was thinking," he began, swallowing thickly. "I used to think love was something you chased, fast, exciting, thrilling. But I see now, real love is what you build, bit by bit, nail by nail." Marquita nodded, tears in her eyes. "Then let's build slow." He smiled. "As slow as you need." It was a balmy Sunday evening at Voices of Victory, a community concert hosted by Faith Sounds. Marquita stood on stage, radiant in a flowing green dress, eyes closed as she sang. The lights weren't flashy, but her glow could have lit the whole sanctuary. Armani sat with Ken in the crowd, legs bouncing. As soon as his mom finished the last line, the boy broke into a sprint, giggling across the aisle. "Mommy!" The audience chuckled as he tackled her knees in a hug. She scooped him into her arms. Then she noticed Ken standing at the front of the aisle, a small velvet box in his hand. He didn't kneel. He didn't speak loudly. He just whispered, "No pressure, no expectations, just a promise. If you're ready." Tears welled up. Marquita looked down at Armani. then at the man who broke her and rebuilt her faith. She didn't say yes, but she didn't walk away, and as the choir began to sing again, Ken slipped the ring into her palm and took her hand as they faced the altar together, a family, mended by mercy, rebuilt by love. 1 year had passed since Marquita sang on stage with Armani clinging to her side and Ken silently offering her a new beginning in the form of a velvet ring box. Spring returned to Atlanta with a hum of life. The air was warmer, the flowers more defiant, and in the small corner of the city where faith, family, and second chances met, everything had shifted. Marquita now lived in a cozy 2-story home nestled close to her gospel studio. It wasn't extravagant, but it was hers, down to the creaking porch and the wind chimes that sang, even when no one else could. Ken still had his penthouse, but most days he was at Marquita's, not to impress, but to belong. Their love wasn't about grand gestures anymore. It was slower, rooted, like sourdough rising after being kneaded through storms. They still hadn't set a wedding date. They didn't need to. What they had was growing with intention, not rushed, not forced. As the sun peeked through the window one morning, Ken poured orange juice for Armani, who sat at the breakfast table in a Marvel t-shirt, humming. Marquita entered in slippers and a head wrap, smiling at the sight. "This," she whispered as she looked at the two of them, "is what tomorrow looks like." Armani had become the heartbeat of their world. 1 year ago he struggled to stay awake through his ABCs. Now he couldn't stop asking questions about everything from dinosaurs to God's favorite color. He attended Faith Charter Academy, a small school that prided itself on nurturing both spirit and mind. His teachers adored him. His friends followed him on the playground like he was their mayor. "Did you know my mommy sings on the radio?" he told one kid. "And my daddy made robots once, but now he makes pancakes." Marquita laughed when his teacher repeated the story during parent night. "He's doing well," the teacher added, eyes warm. "But more than that, Armani knows love. It shows in how he treats others." Ken knelt beside Armani one evening after school, helping him with spelling homework. "Daddy, did you know love can heal people?" Ken smiled, placing his hand on his son's heart. "I know it now. Because of you." Armani leaned in, whispering, "Then maybe I healed you too." Faith Sound Studio had grown from 2 practice rooms to a thriving community hub. Word spread through Atlanta, not because of press or publicity, but because broken people were leaving whole. Youth choirs, adults relearning harmony, even retirees forming gospel quartets. It became a lighthouse for anyone needing a voice. Marquita's Tuesday night workshops were always full. Her Thursday morning devotionals with songs were now streamed online. One went viral, her singing "Take Me to the King" while Armani clapped behind her in a suit and tie. Sponsors reached out. Grants were approved, but she was intentional with growth. No overexpansion, no compromise. Ken offered to digitize the studio systems and even helped create a scholarship fund for underprivileged kids. She let him, but not without clear boundaries. "This isn't your charity project," she told him one evening as they reviewed paperwork. He nodded. "I know. It's your ministry. I just want to be the bass line beneath your melody." That night, she kissed him softly, not out of impulse, but because she believed him. There had been no proposal ceremony, no fireworks, just that velvet box from a year ago, still tucked safely in her jewelry drawer. But that spring, as they attended a wedding for one of her choir students, Marquita quietly slipped the ring onto her finger. Ken noticed as she reached for the communion cup that Sunday at church. He didn't ask. She didn't explain. But later, as they walked through a community fair, holding cotton candy and Armani's hand between them, Ken whispered, "So I guess this means I'm your fiancé now." She bumped his shoulder playfully. "Don't get too excited." "Oh, I'm honored, humbled, and lucky," she added, smirking. "No," he replied, turning serious. "I'm just finally where I was always meant to be." They didn't talk about wedding dates yet. For now, they were building something that wouldn't collapse under pressure. Intentional, steady, sacred. Their story had quietly touched many, even those they never knew were watching. So when Pastor Gillespie announced testimony Sunday at Faith Revival Tabernacle, everyone in the congregation waited for Marquita and Ken to walk up to the altar. They stood hand in hand, Armani in a matching vest. Marquita spoke first. "This isn't about love fixing everything. Because love didn't heal my son, God did. But love showed up anyway, and stayed." The church hummed with approval. Ken took the mic. I wasn't raised here. I wasn't raised like many of you. But this place, this woman, this child, they've shown me what grace looks like, what faith requires. Applause broke out. Later that day, the community gathered for a fish fry outside the church. Kids ran with bubbles, elders swapped stories, and the choir harmonized while Ken helped Pastor Gillespie flip catfish. Marquita leaned against a tree, watching him laugh without pretense. "See," Aunt Ebony whispered beside her. "I told you that man just needed a little bit of soul and a whole lot of prayer." Marquita smiled. And time. That evening, Marquita sat by the piano in her studio, sunlight pouring in through the stained glass, windows Ken had installed months ago. Armani was upstairs, fast asleep. Ken came in, tie loosened, holding her favorite tea. She began playing softly, a tune they once hummed during the hardest nights in the hospital. He stood beside her, wrapping his arm around her waist. "No big wedding?" he teased. "No need, no honeymoon?" She raised an eyebrow. "Not unless you count spring break with Armani at Grandma's." They laughed, then sat in silence. He kissed her temple and whispered, "You changed everything, Marquita." She looked up at him, this man who once left her in pain, who now knelt daily beside her in prayer. "No," she said quietly. "We didn't just heal." She placed his hand over hers on the keys. "We built something holy,